Let's recite the Heart Sutra. So I don't know if you've got it there, but never mind. I want you just to listen to it. I'll recite it, and you listen. We've done that before, haven't we? We've done the Heart Sutra, haven't we? Good, okay. So just listen. I think just listen. Just listen. And actually, I've got a nice little thing here. Actually, let me read this to you first. This is very nice. This is from Geshe Tekchok, who's my philosophy teacher. I studied with him many years ago. He's passed away now. And actually, he's the author of this marvelous book. If you want to take some titles of books away to study emptiness, his wonderful book published by Wisdom called Insight into Emptiness. I think it's called that, by Geshe Tekchok. This is from him. This is a brilliant book. He wrote that especially for modern students, Western people. We'll read the sutra. Just read the sutra and meditate on the meaning. Get whatever meaning you can from it. That's all we can do, you know. So imagine we're there on Vulture Peak with the Buddha, sitting in meditation. And his two students, his two disciples, Shariputra, and then, as it says, Avalokitesvara, but as the 10th level bodhisattva, meaning as looking like a human being. They're having this conversation, and basically they're saying Buddha's words. He's channeling his thoughts into them. And they're speaking, but it's actually his teaching. Apparently he gave many teachings like this. Thus did I hear at one time. The Bhagavan was dwelling on mass of Vulture's mountain in Rajagriha, together with a great community of monks and a great community of bodhisattvas. At that time, the Bhagavan was absorbed in the concentration on the categories of phenomena called profound perception. Also at that time, the Bodhisattva, Mahasattva, Arya, Avalokitesvara looked upon the very practice of the profound perfection of wisdom and beheld those 5 aggregates also as empty of inherent nature. Then through the power of Buddha, the Venerable Shariputra said this to the Bodhisattva, Mahasattva, Arya, Avalokitesvara: how should any son of the lineage train who wishes to practice the activity of the profound perfection of wisdom? He said that, and the Bodhisattva, Mahasattva, Arya, Avalokitesvara said this to the Venerable Sharadvatiputra: Shariputra, any son of the lineage or daughter of the lineage who wishes to practice the activity of the profound perfection of wisdom should look upon it like this, correctly and repeatedly beholding those 5 aggregates also as empty of inherent nature. So now the extensive answer. Form is empty. Emptiness is form. Emptiness is not other than form. Form is also not other than emptiness. In the same way, feeling, discrimination, compositional factors and consciousness are empty. Shariputra, likewise, all phenomena are emptiness without their characteristic, unproduced, unceased, stainless, not without stain, not deficient, not fulfilled. Shariputra, therefore, in emptiness, there is no form, no feeling. This is the 5 aggregates, all the different categories. I've got them in the headings here, but you must have them in your course notes, I suppose. No form, no feeling, no discrimination, no compositional factors, no consciousness. And then the 6 sense consciousnesses: no eye, no ear, no nose, no tongue, no body, no mind, which means mental consciousness. The 6 sense objects: no visual form, no sound, no odor, no taste, no object of touch, and no phenomenon. The 6 sense elements. This is referring to a subtle physical energy that we don't talk about in the West. There is no I element, and so on up to and including no mind element and no mental consciousness element. There is, and then the 12 links. There is no ignorance, no extinction of ignorance, and so on up to and including no aging and death and no extinction of aging and death. The 4 noble truths. Similarly, there is no suffering, origination, cessation, and path. There is no exalted wisdom, no attainment, and also no non-attainment. Shariputra, therefore, because there is no attainment, bodhisattvas rely on and dwell in the perfection of wisdom, the mind without obscuration and without fear. Having completely passed beyond error, they reach the end point of nirvana. All the Buddhas who dwell in the 3 times also manifestly, completely awaken to unsurpassable, perfect, complete enlightenment in reliance on the perfection of wisdom. Therefore, the mantra of the perfection of wisdom, the mantra of great knowledge, the unsurpassed mantra, the mantra equal to the unequaled, the mantra that thoroughly pacifies all suffering, should be known as truth, since it is not false. the mantra of the perfection of wisdom is declared. Taya taung gate gate paragate parasamgate bodhisvaha. Shariputra, the bodhisattva mahasattva, should train in the profound perfection of wisdom like that. Then the Bhagavan arose from that concentration and commended the bodhisattva mahasattva Arya Avalokitesvara, saying, well said, son of the lineage. It is like that. It is like that. One should practice the profound perfection of wisdom just as you have indicated. Even the Tathagatas rejoice. The Bhagavan, having thus spoken, the Venerable Sharadvatiputra, the Bodhisattva, Mahasattva Arya Avalokitesvara, those surrounding in their entirety, along with the world of gods, humans, asuras and Gandharvas, were delighted, were overjoyed, and highly praised that spoken by the Bhagavan. So we've been looking over these weeks at, more broadly, we've been looking finally at, yes, indeed, how things have no intrinsic nature, but mainly in the framework of everything being a dependent arising. And also how we've been looking at the way that the teachings are presented in this packaging called the Lamrim, that starting from the beginning, everything is organized, everything's presented in a really orderly, organized way to lead us, finally, to the sixth of the six perfections of the Bodhisattva, which is the realization of emptiness. So everything is leading to that. It's not evident all the way through, it's kind of implicit, but everything is guiding us to help us then finally get our head around how the final way, the ultimate way, the final way that Buddha describes how everything exists, which is the basis of what he's talking about all the way. All the rest of the Lamrim is his presentation of how things exist conventionally. And then finally, you have all those conventional phenomena exist ultimately. So as we've been talking in daily life, we don't talk like this. We think this is the scientist's job, isn't it? This is the philosopher's job. Why should I do this? But no, on the contrary, the Buddha would say, because we are all driven by misconceptions, we're all driven by all these emotional afflictions, these delusions, as well as all the other misconceptions about conventional reality, literally about what is true and what is not. All Buddhism is a presentation of the Buddha's own direct experiential findings about what exists and what doesn't. The entire path is that, The entire path is that. And why is he so concerned about us getting to see how things exist? It seems fairly abstract, When we hear that Buddhism is a path for getting happiness, that makes sense. A path to stop suffering, that makes sense. Even we hear Buddhism about a system of good ethics, that makes complete sense. But to hear that it's a path of wisdom to help us unpack and unravel the misconceptions in our mind in order to get to see how things exist ultimately, that seems abstract to us. That just seems like a bit of clever philosophy. You pass your exams, No, this is the final point for the Buddha. The point he's making is the extent to which we suffer is the extent to which we are not in touch with reality. That's the literal point that Buddha is making from the beginning to the end of his entire presentation of reality. His entire path, all his ethics, everything. And this is quite fascinating. So the very first level of practice, as we've been discussing in the junior school, the presentation of the Lamrim at the first stages. Then he's telling us all about karma. And we think, well, why should we talk about karma? Who cares, Well, because Buddha says that's how everything exists. And he's not being rude, but if he says if you think you've been created by somebody, it's better than nothing. You can have faith in a creator. You live a very excellent life. It'll cause you to have a happy rebirth. But he says it's not the reality. Don't think he's being shocking. He's telling you what he's found to be true. He's allowed to do that. Everyone's allowed to do that. But then he presents his findings. He's not demanding we believe him. He says, no, you're not created by anybody. Your mother doesn't make you. Your father doesn't make you. A creator doesn't make you. He has no concept of a creator. He says the law of karma, cause and effect, that runs the universe. That your mind is not physical. It's not the handiwork of mummy, daddy, or God. It doesn't come from nowhere. It's not a function of the brain. It's a non-physical continuity of mental moments that's driven by this law of karma, that's such that everything you think and do and say so sees in your mind that produce your future. Well, honey, he's telling us you created yourself. That's a big surprise to us. And we think, well, why should I care? He says, well, because it's reality, babe. It's reality. And believing in something that isn't true can only cause you suffering. This is a very shocking idea to us, you know. This is reality, he says. That's conventional reality. So already what's interesting about that, as we talked, I'm sure, cause and effect, which is the law of karma, is actually an example of the first level of dependent arising. And as Lama Yeshe says, paraphrasing Tsongkhapa, dependent arising is the king of logics to prove emptiness. So already we're starting to sort of loosen the grip of ego grasping by finally taking this view that I'm the creator of myself, that I come into this life program with my own rubbish and my own happiness, instead of looking out there going, well, who made me? Whose fault is it? Hey, look right here, please. Already this begins to loosen the grip of ego grasping, loosen the grip of poor self-pity me who didn't ask to get born, whose fault it is not. Karma is profound from that point of view. That's not explicitly taught, like we've been talking in the first level of practice. The explicit teaching is behave nicely and stop harming others, because that'll cause you to have a better human rebirth. Then the next level of practice, we start to look into the mind, get to the root of it, and we start to look into the way the mind works, and this really prepares us for getting to the final way that the mind exists, because we're looking at the delusions. We're learning to distinguish between the delusions and the virtues in the mind. This is Buddhist model of the mind. He divides all the categories, or he categorizes all the contents of our mind into three categories. The first lot are the ridiculous up a creek without a paddle, not up a garden without a paddle, up a creek without a paddle, lost the plot completely, delusions, ego grasping that believes as an inherent me, attachment to get what that me wants, anger when it doesn't, all these dramas supporting a complete fabricated fantasy. We already begin to learn that in high school, middle scope, when we learn to understand how the mind works. This is really preparing us to get to the root delusion, to uproot that root delusion, which is the cause of all the suffering in the first place. So it's all leading us to this. It's implicit perhaps, but it's all leading us to it logically. It's a very coherent presentation. Then we get to the bodhisattva path and we start adding compassion to the mix, which continues to rip out delusions, because every time you reach out to another person, you're loosening the grip of your own self-centeredness, and you're loosening the grip of the intrinsic me. There are two main problems, you see. The root problem is called ego grasping, which we've been dealing with. Ego grasping, the colloquial term used to refer to the root delusion, literally called ignorance, ma rigpa, that clings to the self-existent, clings to a separate, concrete me-ness. So the consequence of that is we're caught up in a concrete sense of a separate me. What conquers that is realizing emptiness. There is no intrinsic separate me. Emptiness conquers that. That's wisdom. But the other consequence of this ego grasping is that we are self-centered. We put self first. Well, what conquers that is bodhicitta. And they both help each other. A bird needs two wings. You can have high levels of bodhicitta, but you're still not out of samsara until you realize emptiness. You can realize emptiness and become a Hinayana Arhat, but you're not nearly as powerful as you could be if you added bodhicitta to the mix. So, okay, up until now we've been discussing, we went, I think, into detail about, did we do the IKEA thing, buying the box of me? Okay, good. That's really looking at how we really, the grosser level of ego grasping that makes us believe that there's a separate part, as opposed to ears and eyes and noses and anger and jealousy and toenails. We have another part called I. We're looking at that one, but that's not the end yet. That's not the final conclusion. There's a more subtle level at which things exist as empty, and there's a more subtle level, therefore, of how things exist conventionally, which is dependent arising. So let's now discuss that one. In one sense, this seems easier. It's kind of odd. It's the most difficult. And this is only the level at which ever Lama Zopa Rinpoche teaches, So, the first level of dependent arising the Buddha started to discuss, and which he counteracted, where he diverged from the Indian views before him. He was arguing first with the view that there is a permanent, uncaused me. Well, the cause and effect counteracts that. No such me, he says. The second level is more subtle, and that's one we've been mostly dealing with. That's the IKEA one, where there's a piece in there. You're looking for you put your leg there, your eye, your nose, your toenail, your bits and pieces. You build up your you in that IKEA box that you buy. You build up all the pieces are there, all the right number of pieces, exactly the number of legs, and exactly the number of breasts, the right number of eyelashes, all the millions of pieces, and you construct yourself. And the strong belief we have is there is a piece we have to finally found that's a very special piece, is called I, self, me, such that when we plug that in, then it becomes a real me. No, you won't find one of them, Buddha says. You don't even need one, which sounds so shocking to us. So then we looked at that one a lot, and so now the subtlest, so that's one that says there is no I, there's no piece called I separate from the other parts. The third one is there is no I separate from the mind that calls it that. That everything, so the first one is everything exists in dependence upon causes. That's impermanent phenomena. Then everything exists, the next one, everything exists in dependence upon their bits and pieces, the parts. This third one, everything exists in dependence upon the mind calling it that. The mind labeling it that from the side of the object there is not one atom of anything that makes it that. So of course this sounds ridiculous. We can't even hear it properly, So let's look at ordinary things. It's not even that complicated. In one way it's not difficult. In one way we can see how this is true. So Lama Zopa in his book, I remember I mentioned a book, I think, of Rinpoche's, a wonderful book. It's come out recently. I keep promising to send you the link to it, and I never do. I might do it. I'll do it again this time. It's a book of Lama Zopa's that he named himself. It's called, now I forget, How to Enjoy Life Free of the Inner Prison, so that the outer prison doesn't become the real prison. That's the title and the subtitle. And Rinpoche asked me to do it, to compile all the hundreds of letters that he received over the last 20 years. From people in prison they've written to him, and he's written back to them. So it's this amazing teachings, advice to all the prisoners, but of course it's advice to all of us. There's no difference. It's just so much more poignant and more intense when it's written to these people, many on death row, many life sentences, and so on and so forth. So there's wonderful teachings he gave to one man. He wrote a letter of about 45 pages to one of the prisoners. Amazing. Must have taken him weeks to write it, And there's extensive teachings on emptiness in there. And this is a typical example. And this is a very good example. All the lamas use this example. It's very simple. So he used the example of the alphabet. There you are, little girl, little boy. You've never learned the alphabet before, and you go to school for the first time, and the teacher's got the blackboard. Maybe now these days it's a whiteboard. I don't know what people use anymore. Maybe they don't use chalk anymore. I don't know. But anyway, blackboard when I was at school. And she wrote on the board, she wrote this design, like that, and then a one across that way. So 3 lines. 3 lines. And she said, this is A. So we'd never heard that before. Brand new information for us. Oh, really, Mummy? Then go home, Mummy, I learned what A is. So the point is this. Listen to this. It's so simple, but it doesn't make much sense to us. Before you learned the alphabet, those 3 lines were there. They've been there for 20 million years. I mean, however long, whoever it was who started to write those letters, the Roman lettering, whoever created them, that A has been there for so long. It's always, but you've never known it. You've never known that was A. Nobody in a million years, as long as you stood there looking at that 3 lines, you could stand there for a million years. And it will take you a long time, if you were fortunate, to come up with the concept, that is A. Why? Why is it not evident? Why is it not evident when you look at those 3 lines put together like that for the first time? Why is it not evident that it's called A? I mean, we just take this for granted. We know, well, I haven't learned it yet. We know that. I haven't learned it yet. I haven't learned it yet. Well, precisely. Already, if we're really sharp, we will now, this second, have a realization of emptiness. I promise you. This is logic to prove that A does not exist intrinsically from its own side. Right there. We go, huh? What are you talking about? In other words, what happens is this. We learn it. We learn, that is A. Then we go B, C. We learn all those shapes. We learn them, Then we memorize them. But this is what happens. As soon as we learn it, we then forget that actually We had to be told it was A. We had to be told it was A. And then we forget that we learned it. And now what happens when we see it, we forget that somebody labeled it A, but we think now that shape is A from its own side. We think it's A on the blackboard. We forget that it's merely labeled. It seems this way. It is merely labeled. We know that. Because the point is, Buddha's telling us this, and it really doesn't help us much in the beginning. It doesn't blow our mind. What Buddha's telling us is this. Once we've learned it, we then forget that it was merely labeled. The teacher had to tell you. But then you forget that, and now you think the A-ness is in that shape. You forget that it comes from your mind. Basically, when you learn it, you buy into the belief that that shape is called A. That's the right way to say it. You buy into the belief that that shape is called A. But we forget that because of ignorance deep in the mind, its function is to see everything as self-existent, as existing, as if the A is coming from the lines on the blackboard, not from our mind. That's the point. We can hear this kind of a bit, but it floats away. This is how everything exists, it seems. Now, the point is, another simple example, and I used that example, I think, last week, I can't remember. This is a good example, is a prison. I've been to quite a few prisons, okay? And they're usually, they're usually fairly badly designed. Some are fairly well designed, maybe some new ones. But the old ones are really terrible. They're so ugly, they're so gross. So you could really probably say, okay, now before we go further, remember before, Buddha's telling us things exist conventionally. This is a really important part of the whole process. Things have a conventional existence, and then before we begin to discuss the emptiness of that phenomenon, we have to first establish the conventional reality of the phenomenon. So, I've mentioned this many times. So, what's that, mummy? Well, sweetheart, that's called a thermos. Well, what is it? This is a perfectly reasonable question. So she will just, as you can see, Robina, it's a flat-bottomed metal container. Now that's the first part of the definition. The first part of the definition of anything tells you its conventional characteristics. But that's not enough yet. You're not happy yet. You need the second part of the definition. This is a major way of learning to understand how things exist, okay? You've got to first agree on the conventional existence of something. And this already is implying that you can't separate emptiness. We did this last week, I'm quite sure. You can't separate emptiness from the conventional. Like in the Heart Sutra it says, form is emptiness, emptiness is form. I'm sure we went through that last week. So, but what does it, this is the really key question. Mummy, but what does it do? What is its meaning? What is the meaning of that? That's a good question. What's the meaning of it? What is its function? I can't describe how important this is in order for when we do realize emptiness. You have to, this is where also seeing emptiness within the framework of the two truths, conventional reality and ultimate reality. And putting it simply, like I'm sure we discussed last week, that emptiness is a characteristic of every conventional thing that exists. You can't find emptiness apart from a thing. That's the two truths. You can't find the emptiness of form apart from form, and you will not find form apart from the emptiness of form. Emptiness as form, like we discussed, is simply a name referring to a certain characteristic that every phenomenon possesses. So we first have to establish what does exist conventionally. Once we've ticked the boxes and all agreed, we can now discuss how that clearly defined, agreed upon conventional phenomenon exists ultimately. These are the words, okay? So okay, let's look at the phenomenon called prison. I'm sure we've discussed this one. Well, I would very happily tell you the definition of a prison, you know. My own definition is it's usually an ugly building, you know, with barbed wire, pretty ugly, internally and externally, where you're sent where you're naughty, or you're thought to be naughty, even often when you're not naughty, and you can't escape. That's pretty much what a prison is. The key function of a prison is you can't escape. You're locked in. I mean, you might have a much filthier house where you live, but you can walk out the door. So the real pain of prison, we know, is the fact that you're locked there. You're locked in there, and you can't escape. We know that's the suffering of being in a prison. So, okay. So, all right. This is the point. This is the point now about this merely labelled prison, merely labelled thermos, merely labelled I, merely labelled everything, merely labelled A. I'll just say this statement first and we'll go back on it. When we have established, as Lama Zopa puts it like this, when we have established, when we have realized the emptiness of the self-existent prison, the emptiness of the intrinsic prison, the emptiness of the prison existing from its own side. When we've realized that emptiness, he says it's as if there is no prison. But dependent arising, but there is a prison that functions exactly as we labelled it. When you haven't realised the emptiness of prison, you're still locked in and you can't escape. When you have realised the emptiness of prison, you're still locked in, you can't escape. That never changes. That's the function of a prison. Okay, when you have not realised the empty nature of the thermos, and when you have realised the emptiness of the intrinsic thermos, when you know that the thermos is merely labelled, when you know there is no intrinsic thermos, when you know it utterly, completely, you had a direct realisation, you know there's no intrinsic thermos, then still the thermos, conventionally, whether you've realised it or not, will still hold your tea and make you happy when you drink from it. So what I'm even getting here is this: emptiness of something doesn't deny existence. It's, in other words, it's a question of not, what we do now is we have the two extreme views. We hear, oh, the thermos has no intrinsic nature. What we hear is, oh, well, there's really no thermos. Chuck the baby out with the bathwater, might as well die, there's nothing, everything's empty, it doesn't matter. That's how we hear it. That's nihilism. You've chucked out the baby with the bathwater. You've heard emptiness as denying existence. No. And then as soon as you hear the dependent arising, there is a thermos that exists in dependence upon causes and conditions, etc., etc. You go, oh, thank God there is. Grasp. There's something to hold on to after all. No, that's the other extreme. So we run between these two extremes of eternalism and nihilism. Is what they say, quite literally. So emptiness of intrinsic nature, lacking existence from its own side, everything possesses that. Everything that exists conventionally lacks an intrinsic character. Everything that exists dependent arising, as a dependent arising, it arises in dependence upon causes, it arises in dependence upon its bits and pieces, it arises finally in dependence upon the mind calling it that. That's the way of describing how it exists conventionally. And when we're on the right track, that tells us, it reinforces for us that, of course, that means it has no intrinsic character. And every time we think about how there's no thermos from its own side, there's no prison from its own side, there's no prison from its own side, that tells us that there is a dependently arisen prison. But what we've got to get used to is, as soon as we say there is something, we grasp at it. As soon as we say there isn't something, we throw the baby out the bathwater. These are the two extremes. And if we can get past that and begin to hear that each one doesn't deny the other, isn't the opposite to the other, they reinforce each other. When we know that, we're on the right track, even intellectually. And that just takes time. Squeeze our brains, basically, as Lamrim puts it. So a prison, conventionally, what's a prison, mummy? Well, there's one over there, darling. You can see it's pretty ugly, big tall walls with barbed wire on it, and people, you can see those little tiny windows. People are living in their own little cell, and they're only allowed out a couple of hours a day, and they're not allowed out the big main gate, sometimes for 20 years, sometimes for 30 years, and the food's pretty ugly, and I can promise you it is. Some prisons, maybe it's nice. As I told you, some friend of mine in Norway wrote me a couple of years ago, was so excited, I told you this, I think, he was so excited to go to prison for a couple of years because he was going to get an education. It was in the bush, it was a lovely place, well designed, like a spa, education, all free. He couldn't wait to go, he was looking for like a retreat. So it just shows, Still called a prison though. So interesting. So anyway, merely labelled. Merely labelled. So the yogis, when they've realized there's no intrinsic thermos, they're one set of the words. When they've realized that, they're certain there's no thermos coming from the thermos. But nevertheless, it still functions when they use it to keep their tea warm. So there's not a contradiction. The major one is to keep saying to yourself that emptiness does not deny existence. The first instinct we have is that it does. No, it reinforces existence. In fact, using these words, something only can exist because it doesn't have an intrinsic nature. And this is Buddha's point, masses of teachings, extensive teachings. Well, once we understand what something would be like if it did exist intrinsically, if it did exist inherently, and this is part of this problem, we don't have definitions in our culture for these words. You can't just try and make them up. You've got to know what it means. The best word to cover all of these words, which are all synonymous, is the word independent. So something intrinsic and something inherent means there's nothing in the thermos that is not dependent on something. That's the meaning. The real meaning is independent. So there can't be anything that's independent of causes, secondly, of its parts, thirdly, of the mind calling it that. Because this is the point. If A existed in those three lines, if A were intrinsic, if A were inherent within the three lines, anybody seeing it would immediately know it is A. Everything would be this way. We've got to think of that. This is not just Buddha, this is Buddha's analysis. So if you want to understand what he means, you've got to use his analysis. You can't make up your own. You'll never just, it's like you think 1 + 1 is 3, but he says 1 + 1 is 2. Well, there's no point in having a debate. You just got to work out you all agree on your terms first, please. So we've all got to agree on the meaning of inherent, intrinsic, established from its own side, existing from its own side, existing in and of itself, existing independent of mind, parts and label, all these different words, and all these are synonymous in this Prasangika Madhyamika view. So we're looking, so that what Buddha says, we think in here there's I, a piece called I, that's the grosser one. But what we've got to see more subtly is that you realize you won't find that I there. But as His Holiness says, that's not the real premise. So the I, or the thermos, or the prison, they're not empty of intrinsic nature because you can't find an intrinsic prison, an intrinsic I, an intrinsic thermos. They're not empty because you can't find one, and you can't. No, that's not the real premise. Everything is empty, everything lacks an intrinsic character because they are dependent arisings. Because they're dependent arising. That's the real premise. That's what they say. So Buddha's saying if something did exist from its own side, in and of itself, without depending on my mind experiencing it, my mind labeling it, then if everything existed like that, then it wouldn't matter how you saw it. You could think Fred was the most handsome man on the planet, but if he's intrinsically ugly, which is what his past girlfriend will tell you, then you'll never see him beautiful. It's not possible. Nothing could ever change. Nothing could ever change. Everything would be frozen in space. It would be insanity. So this is the point. My friend Sunny, whom I tell you about, was in this garbage dump of a prison, wrongly accused of murder. Her husband got executed. His head burst into flames in the execution chamber. She saw it. Her children, she lost her children because her parents were killed in a car accident and they were sent into the system. It was the most nightmarish experience you could ever imagine. One nightmare after the other. Sitting in this single cell on her own for years on end with a Bible. Completely innocent. This little hippie, didn't know what happened to her. So, we would think that, and this is the point now, this is exactly the truth. It was a garbage dump. It's the truth. It fits the definition of a garbage dump, that prison. It fits the definition of wrongly accused. She was wrongly accused. It is correct that she was innocent. These are valid statements of conventional truth. She was innocent. She killed nobody. Her husband was executed. He didn't kill anybody. Her children were given away. Her parents died, etc. These are facts. Conventional facts. This is the point now. These are all conventional facts. But we believe that they somehow exist unfairly, outside, separate from me. Even this is the view of karma already is profound to counteract this one. Karma is an example of cause and effect, which is a perfect example of the first level of dependent arising, that everything exists in our life in dependence upon causes created by us in the past. Already, this can loosen the fear, the panic, the rage, the despair. It doesn't seem evident to us immediately. So if all of that, which is conventional truth, were true intrinsically, were in the bones of those events, then she could never, ever have changed her mind and become a happy, wise person, which is exactly what she did. As she said, finally I realized I couldn't change anything. But they couldn't take my mind from me. This is the final meaning of emptiness. She was experiencing suffering. She was innocent. She was in a garbage dump. She was in a horrible cell on her own with a Bible 23 hours a day. Her husband had been executed. His head had burst into flames. Her children had gone. The parents had been killed. These are facts. Now, normally, this is my point, we would say they are descriptions of a nightmare for a person, and it's perfectly reasonable to go out of your mind and go mad. Well, she didn't go mad. So if these things were inherently existent, in and of themselves, having nothing to do with how she saw them, then she could never ever have seen them any differently, and she could never ever have been anything but out of her brain with rage and despair. But she knew she could reinterpret this experience. She knew she could change the label. If A were intrinsically A, inherently A, not depending on the mind calling it A, not depending on the mind buying into it as A. If it did exist like that, it could never be anything other than A. And you'd know it as soon as you met it. In fact, the Buddha's saying it's a joke because nothing could exist this way. Of course, we don't think like this because we don't do this analysis, but he's telling us this ego grasping within us, this marikpa, is grasping at everything as being inherent, as everything as being uncaused, partless, rock solid, unchanging, permanent, set in stone. This is why we go mad. All the path up to now are preparing our mind, abiding by the laws of karma, looking into our mind, unpacking and unraveling its contents, getting bodhicitta. Now we are perfectly placed to easily get to realize emptiness because our mind has now been super prepared, breaking down all the concreteness and the solidity and the other crazy delusions. This is perfect presentation, getting us perfectly now prepared to easily realize emptiness. Every single thing, event, thought, action, object exists like this, dependent arising. Everything we say, everything is dependent on parts, dependent on causes, but this final one, dependent on the mind buying into it as that. But as soon as we hear that, we hear, oh, it's only in the mind, then you can make up whatever you like. You can call a thermos a ping pong if you want to. No, because you've got to first define a thermos. You've got to say what it is. Conventionally, it's a flat-bottom metal container that keeps my tea warm. That's its function. I don't care what you call it. You can change the English language and come up with a new word. You've got a lot of work to do that, but that's still its function. That'll always be its function. So everything, the thermos is empty of existing from its own side. There's not an atom of thermos there, but it still functions to hold your tea warm. These are the two truths together. So let's look at the me. It's interesting, the me, me, what's the me, Well, one of the really powerful arguments about how there's no intrinsic me. The key function of believing in the intrinsic me is that it creates other. Look at the way we all think about me. As soon as there's me, there's other. And because of ego grasping, we cling to me most, we put me first, we think me is more important, we think of me all the time, we try to get what me wants, and as long as you agree with me, then you be my friend and you're an object of my attachment, but if you don't, you're in the enemy category, and the rest of them do neither, so I couldn't care about them. This is the universe, friends, enemies, and strangers, the objects of the three poisons, which are all the function of this grasping at the me, the separate me. So relatively speaking, there is a bunch of separate me's right now on this Zoom. There are, I can see them, look, there's all these separate me's. There's Kathleen, there's Tali, there's Ariana, there's Graciela, we've got our own names, haven't we? If we're all called Mary, it'd be a bit confusing. We've got separate names, separate identities, different noses, shapes, male, boys, girls, who knows what other agendas these days. We are definitely lots of separate me's, but this is the point. It's not an intrinsically separate me, but there is a separate me conventionally. But when we buy into intrinsic separate me, that's when there's other, and that's when there's intrinsic other, and other means opposite to me. So then if we start to loosen that one, this is what bodhicitta can help do. Bodhicitta is when you finally make this paradigm shift in your mind, where now others are more important than me. This is not reinforcing ignorance. This is just smashing the natural instinct of ego grasping, but to put me first. And by the time you add emptiness to that, wow, you're sailing, aren't you? It's incredible. Because they say when you finally are Buddha, there's literally no longer an experience of any separate me. You manifest in a body because you want to help sentient beings. You're called Fred, and there's Mary over there, but your mind is it's a mere convention. It's a mere label. It's a mere convention. Your experience is of total oneness with that other person's mind, not to mention having clairvoyance that sees their mind perfectly and all their past and future, not to mention having only compassion and empathy for that person as if they were you and wanting only to help them, and not to mention having all the wisdom that sees exactly how to do that. That's all there. So there's no longer a fraction of a thought of a separate me. But conventionally, there's still me and Mary. Mary and I, if you're a Buddha, Mary and you don't kind of merge by like some magnet. Suddenly there's one person there. No, two people is a convention. It's a dualistic world. We live in the dualistic world. And that's why the Lamas talk about everything's illusory, everything just like play acting. There's no separate me. Your mind is oneness with everybody when you're a Buddha, but you still act like respectfully to Mary and Joe and Fred, because that's conventional world. But you don't buy into that lie. But we have the lie in the mind that there is a separate me intrinsically, which means, it's an intrinsically separate me. No, it's not. But there's still a me. You don't disappear into space when you realize the emptiness of me. The thermos doesn't disappear into space when you realize the emptiness of the thermos. The A doesn't disappear into a puff of smoke when you realize the A is merely labeled. So all the thing we did about IKEA, thinking about IKEA, that's a stepping stone to this one. It's very powerful. You've got to do that one first. You've got to realize there's not a single anything that exists that possesses some intrinsic separate part called whatever that might be, lamp, mugness, computerness, No, you won't find that. But it's a limited analysis. When you're analyzing the parts, which are the valid, they talk about the valid base. Everything has to have a valid base. So the valid base for the label thermos is here, this flat bottom metal container that keeps it warm. That's a valid base. But why? Because it fits the definition. And the name is thermos. So when we start to analyze, Robina is the name for this valid base. These parts, this body and this mind, these aggregates. When we've become confident that there's no other piece there, a little self-existent little piece called Robina that's like runs the show, the mini me in there. When we've realized that, what we're doing is we've realized there's no intrinsic piece in there, but we are reaffirming, in a sense, we are affirming that there are the other parts. Because Robina is a label on the parts. So if we stop there, then we haven't done all the analysis yet. First, you have to realize the emptiness of the I, and then you have to realize the emptiness of the aggregates and all the other phenomena. So first you realize the emptiness of the I. There's no intrinsic piece in there called I. Then you realize that I is merely a label that we impute with our mind upon the valid parts. And then we can think, oh, phew, I must have something. I've got some parts. Oh, what a relief. We haven't gone far enough yet. No, because body, which is one of the parts, which is the valid basis for the label Robina, body is also merely a label we impute with our mind upon its parts. Oh, so I have an ear, do I, and a nose and a foot? No, because ear, nose, foot are merely labels we impute with our mind on their parts. And you'll go to every part you can ever think of, down to the micro atoms. Everything is merely labeled on its parts. It's sort of like tricky, yogis being tricky, And that's how everything exists. So from the side of the ear, you will find nothing that makes it intrinsically an ear. There's nothing independent of the mind labeling it that. But nevertheless, it functions exactly as we defined it, as an ear should. It causes you to hear things. So that existence does not contradict emptiness, and emptiness does not contradict existence. As long as you keep remembering that, even if you're puzzled, you are on the right track, and one day the penny will drop, Because now we have the two extreme views. We hear that emptiness denies existence. So make up your mind, Buddha. Is there something or isn't there? It's too gross how we think. It's more nuanced than that. Emptiness reinforces dependent arising. It reinforces existence. And existence, as dependent arising, reinforces emptiness. These two truths come together. All this for the Buddha is simply how things exist. It's just that we haven't thought of it before. So that's why it's confusing to us. This is a presentation of how things exist. When we get it, of course, like everything, it's easy. When you're a great physicist, or when you're a genius IT, or whatever, brilliant person, it's easy for you. When you know something, it's easy. When we don't know it, it's puzzling. So we have to be patient and humble and learn the right words first. Get the theories right first. Then slowly we can think of those words, and gradually we'll put meat on the bones, and the words will go from the head to the heart, and then we'll have the experience of the truth that those words refer to. That's how we learn everything. Do you want to ask any questions?
Can I ask a question?
Yeah, go for it, darling.
Can you define what a valid cognition is? And I think you've done that, but it wasn't clear.
Sure.
And
yeah.
Is the I is not a valid cognition, is that right?
It's not a question of that, no. So there's two things. There's the mind, which they often refer to as subject. So in the mind, and the level of mind we're functioning here at is conceptuality, thoughts, okay? So mind is so when there's a cognition, that's something that occurs in the mind. So that is a cognition. It's a thought, a cognition. Okay, more broadly, cognition, to cognize, to know, or to be aware are three synonyms, and they refer to the function of mind. So whether it's sensory consciousness, or we have sensory consciousness and we have mental consciousness. Sensory consciousness is that part of my mind, and I'll spell it out, that part of my mind that functions through the medium of, for example, the eyeball, right? That's called eye consciousness. Eye consciousness is not referring to the eyeball. Consciousness is not physical. Mind and consciousness are synonymous. So that part of my mind that works nicely with the eyeball, that causes me to have a cognition, and it's dependent on the eyeball doesn't have a cognition, a mind has a cognition. So mind cognizes, eye consciousness cognizes, look, when it meets this object here, mind is subject, my eye consciousness is subject, it cognizes black here. So black is the object of this subject. Black is the object of an eye consciousness. Sound is the object of an ear consciousness, a moment of ear consciousness. That is the eye consciousness sees the three shapes, but mental consciousness concepts, then conceptualizes it and calls it a. So they are valid cognitions. A cognition is what the mind does, either at the sensory level or the mental level. So at the mental level, we live only at the grossest level, which is conceptuality. Everything is conceptuality. We live at the level of conceptuality, which is thoughts. Concepts are thoughts, and that's the level we function at now. Now, Buddha's telling us that we have much subtler level of cognition that we can only access when we have accomplished single-pointed concentration, shamatha, this amazing technique these genius Indians invented 3,000 years ago, which is one of the central techniques still in Buddhism. We need to get that to that subtle level of mind in order to have what they call a direct, non-conceptual cognition, which is when we really realize something. This is on a more subtle level. Meanwhile, we live at a conceptual level. Anger is a concept. How dare you do that to me? But it happens to come along with lots of physical and spit and eyes and shouting, right? You agree? But it's rooted in being a thought that says basically, how dare you do that to me? I do not deserve it. That's the voice of anger. That's the concept of the conceptual thought called anger. So anger is a cognition. It's a thought. but it's not a valid cognition, because what it is cognizing, when my boyfriend doesn't listen to me properly and I've got a habit to be very angry very quickly, I will over exaggerate that action of his not listening to me properly. I will grossly over exaggerate it, and the anger will exaggerate it and will think it will paint a whole picture of him as being ugly, as horrible. How dare you do that to me? I don't deserve it. Anger is an exaggerated concept. It's an exaggeration of the truth. The boyfriend did not listen to me properly, but because I'm very sensitive and I've got lots of anger, my anger is a cognition. You did that. Then it goes on and writes this drama. As our mothers tell us, it makes mountains out of molehills. It's not a valid cognition because it's not seeing everything accurately. It's making up its own exaggerated story. Attachment is a cognition. Attachment, when that's there for the chocolate cake, it over exaggerates the deliciousness of the chocolate cake. It indeed makes a mountain out of molehills and thinks the chocolate cake is completely divine, and when I eat it I'll get really happy. That is not a valid cognition. That is not a valid cognition. That is not what cake's job is. It's not the function of cake. So you have to analyze really carefully. So there are some cognitions that are valid. 1 + 1 is 2. We have all agreed in the science called math. We've all checked the box, agreed, shaken hands, and agreed that 1 + 1 is 2. That's a conventional truth. That's a valid cognition. So a valid cognition is when the thought is in sync with the thing it's referring to. And that's the analysis we have to do. And that's Buddha's key point about all the emotional delusions, that they're liars. But we're so familiar with them, we believe what our attachment sees. I believe what my anger sees. This is how we get paralyzed in samsara. It's a joke to hear that it's not a valid cognition. The boyfriend might have punched me in the nose, but my anger still over-exaggerates it. But even beneath the anger, the ego grasping that clings to intrinsic me, that sees him as intrinsically bad, that causes him to be intrinsically evil out there from his own side. So there is layers and layers and layers of invalid cognitions in everything we do all the time. So that's why we have to have awareness of our mind. It's super subtle, super precise. The key job of being a Buddhist is distinguish between valid and invalid cognitions. Because when you're finally a Buddha, you've thrown out all the invalid cognitions. You are now in sync with reality. This is the whole point of the entire Buddhist path. Are we communicating a bit?
Yes, thank you, Venerable.
Okay, good. It's a real subtle job. This is not an easy job to do, It demands concentration. It demands clarity and ownership and responsibility and a wish to unpack and unravel our mind and distinguish the facts from the fictions. This is the job all the way to Buddhahood. And hang on, Ralph. One more point. And the invalid cognitions are why we suffer. That's it. Yes, Ralph.
Kelly, I think hit on my question as well. First, thank you so much for your valuable teaching tonight. I very much appreciate it.
Good.
You had said earlier that thoughts are dependent arising, and I wanted to explore that with you a little bit, but I think you just did explore that.
Good.
Thoughts
Go
are
on.
dependent arising.
Yeah, good.
Right? In that concepts are thoughts, right? So we're conceptualizing. You were saying our eyeball sees the color black. We conceptualize something. So our thought then is dependent arising on that concept. Is that correct?
Okay, to put it, I hear. So there's different. So let's analyze it again, Ralph. So first of all, and this already is a big eye opener for us to understand that our senses actually are really limited. We give a lot more power to our senses. We think I will say to you, oh, that's a really well designed thermos, Ralph. But eye consciousness can't see that. Eye consciousness can only cognize shape and color. That's it. The rest is a story made up by my mental consciousness, which is where the workshop is, as Lama Zopa says, and that's where all the thoughts and feelings and emotions and cognitions are. So yes, immediately my eye consciousness sees this shape and color. In a millisecond quicker than Google, my mental consciousness is accessed and up comes the thought. That is a well-designed thermos. So what's going on here is eye consciousness sees shape and color. mental consciousness, conceptuality at the gross level, a series of thoughts. They are in my mind based upon my past taste, what I think is good design, blah, blah, blah. Then up comes an opinion called what a well-designed thermos. So now that's what's going on. Now what's your comment on that?
That's my comment. I think I get it. Yeah.
Okay.
Perfect. Yeah.
Yeah, so with the dependent arising part here, there's a million ways that things arise dependently, Ralph. So you could argue in a very simple way here that I have a thought in dependence upon there being a thermos there. That's a dependent arising. There are millions of ways of dependent arising, but the particular dependent arising here that we're looking at is much more subtle. It's that this thought I have, this is a good example, this thought that I have based upon my taste and my education and all the views that I've collected throughout my life, I will make a statement that is a well-designed thermos. Now, the point is here, I will believe in, when I say that, I will believe that here, from its own side, there is definitely a well-designed thermos. I will believe that thermos exists without depending on my mind labeling it. That's the dependent arising we're talking about.
Mm-hmm.
Do you understand?
Mm-hmm.
Good. But it's clear
You're brilliant.
with things like this, because if you've got other tastes and you think it's an ugly thermos, straight away, Ralph, that proves the point. There's no intrinsic delicious or ugly thermos. Our mothers would tell us beauty is in the eye of the beholder. This is proving dependent arising, proving emptiness. You see one thing one way, I see it in another. That proves it's empty of intrinsic existence as this or that. It proves it right there. Do you understand?
Sure. There is no good or bad, only thinking makes it so, said the Bard.
There you go. What did he say? Say it again.
There is no good or bad, only thinking makes it so.
There you go. But the Bard understood,
Shakespeare.
I think. I think he was a Buddhist. I think he knew dependent arising and emptiness. It's wonderful. I love it. Good, Ralph. Thank you so much. What else, people?
I have one, Robina.
Yes, Ariane. Talk to me.
Hello again. What if somebody from another country has never seen your thermos?
That's right.
So they don't know the label.
Precisely.
What conceptually do they do with that? Do they then have to be taught what it is?
But that's exactly, Ariane, what you're just asking is the point about what emptiness is. The fact is that proves there's no intrinsic thermos there. I mean, you're proving the point. Everybody, but we all have to learn it. Everybody has to learn everything.
Yes.
That proves that it's got nothing intrinsic in it because we have to learn it first. That proves
Because if it had something intrinsic, then
we'd all
everybody would
recognize
see
it.
it as a thermos.
Precisely. That's exactly the point.
Got it.
That's right.
Thank you.
Good.
Got it.
There you go. Good start, Ariane. Very well done. So what else, people? Any questions? So the biggest point here, the trouble is here. We can hear these things intellectually, so a few pennies might drop. But then we'll still go, but who cares? Because we still can't see the impact that this realization would have when it's genuine, when it's all the way in. Because the entire universe will appear differently. I mean, even as Lama Zopa said, that lovely story I always tell about Lama Zopa when he was a little boy and he drowned. He was drowning. He was 8, up in the mountains. I always tell this story. He was recognized as a little boy as the reincarnation of a Nyingma yogi, a Sherpa yogi called Kunsang Yeshe. He'd meditated in the mountains the last 20, 30 years of his life. He was a tantric yogi. He got realizations, blah, blah, blah. And like all these great yogis, they can completely choose their death time and they can choose their rebirth. So then anyway, later, this little boy called Zopa, he was recognized when he was about 6 or something. But since he was tiny, there are stories, his sister said, from every time they turned their back, little Zopa's up, they find him crawling up the hill to where they know the Laudo cave is, the cave of the previous Lama. And there they'd always find him curled up asleep in the resting spot, as they called it, a spot halfway up the hill. And from the time he could talk, he'd be trudging up that hill. Come home, his mother would say. No, he would say, that is my home. So somehow, like all these yogis, they talk about how when they've completely got control over their death, which these great tantric yogis can, and they choose their rebirth, quite literally, then initially, when they're very young, they don't lose their memory, They don't lose their memory. They know who they are. But as they get older, they say their memory fades, But the point is this. If you realize emptiness, if you've cut the root of ego grasping, which is the root delusion. Ego grasping is a colloquial term used for this ignorance, ma-rigpa, ignorance, the root delusion. And it's known as ego grasping when it refers to the clinging to the me. So when this ego grasping is cut, when we have seen nakedly and clearly in a very subtle level of mind, in single-pointed concentration, that crystal clear that there never has been, isn't, and never could be that kind of I, an intrinsic I, an independent I, an inherent I, an I existing from its own side, all these words. When we see that clearly and nakedly for the first time, non-conceptually, in the subtlety of your meditation, that you can never lose. That's the first moment of a genuine, non-conceptual, direct insight into the meaning of emptiness. That's what we're aiming for. So when you got that, you've got to continue to grow. You've got more work to do, more obstacles to remove from the mind. But from that second, you begin your climb out of samsara into nirvana. Basically, you can't fall back after that because you've cut the root cause of rebirth. You've cut the root cause of all suffering. So from that time, from that moment, as Amazopa said when he was drowning, the story is there was some weird-looking, strange people on the other side of this big river, these very torrential rivers up there, very strong. He's a little boy, about 8, in a monastery. And he sees these strange-looking people. He said they were pale, they had pale eyes, straw-coloured hair. Well, they sound like Swedish people, don't they? But anyway, they were white people. He'd never seen white people before because he was, he was brown, he was Nepali. So he really wanted to meet them. So he brought his bowl of potatoes as a gift. His manager didn't want him to go. He was very nervous because these rickety bridges and these difficult waters, but he insisted. So he's walking across the bridge with his bowl of potatoes and he falls in the river. And of course, they don't teach them swimming up there. And anyway, the waters are so rough, you couldn't swim. It's so intense. So he said, this is how he told the story. He said, the head kept coming to the surface for air, Now, he didn't say, my head or I kept coming to the surface. He didn't say that. He said the head. I'll explain. This is really helpful. These are really helpful thoughts. He didn't say I kept going to the surface for air, which is how we would. Because when we're fearful, when freak things happen, the whole of me becomes I. Doesn't this panic-stricken I, isn't it? So clear. He didn't say that. He said the head kept going to the surface for air. And he could see his manager panicking, running up and down the riverbank, So then he's in the water, and then he kept going down. And then he said to himself, the thought occurred to me. The person known as the Laudo Lama is about to die. He didn't say, I realize I was about to die. No, he said the person known as the Laudo Lama is about to die. Then he said to himself, he's telling us now, when he told the story, he said, I didn't know anything about emptiness, meaning he was 8 years old, he had no chance to hear the teachings on emptiness yet, but he said, there was no fear. So this is very powerful. They all say, this is the point of all Buddha's teachings. The way they talk about samsara it is the fears of samsara. We are in samsara when we have ego grasping that believes in an intrinsic me, which gives rise to attachment to get what that me wants, which gives rise to anger and panic when it doesn't, and all the other thousands of problems. This is the analysis, this is the evolution, this is the hierarchy of these delusions. These, because we call them normal in our culture, we just think you're a normal person if you've got these. We can't even imagine the possibility of not having ego grasping and attachment and anger and pride and low self-esteem, etc. We factor them in as normal parts of a normal person, which is why this talking is so shocking. Buddha has found that these neuroses are not at the core of our being. They are fabrications. They are made up. They are not valid cognitions. They're fantasies. They have no basis in reality. And because they have no basis in reality, they are not intrinsic to the mind. You can remove them from the mind. And when you have removed them from the mind, you no longer, as Lama Zopa says, Lama Yeshe says, when you realize emptiness, you've realized that fantasy I that you've believed in since beginningless time, which is the basis of attachment and anger and all the other delusions. When you realize there isn't that I, then there is no longer fear. This is very hard to hear. This is not the way we think in our psychology or neuroscience. It's just really hard to hear this. That means the more we listen to and think about these concepts and try to understand them logically, we will begin to understand intellectually how that's so. He said there was no fear. Now this is interesting because, whoever it was, Mr. Darwin or somebody, wasn't it, who posited this idea of instinct for survival, that we need that in order to then become alert and know how to stop yourself from drowning. Well, Buddha says, no, he disagrees with that analysis. I think that instinct for survival is another very nice word for ego grasping. Because ego grasping, the root delusion, is asleep most of the time. It's like a sleeping lion. And it's only when you're offended or insulted or you nearly drown or a car nearly runs over you, it's only then that it arises. This fear arises, this panic. I did not do that. I am nearly drowning. How dare you do that to me? It rises very powerfully, and that is the nature of fear. So when you've cut that, of course there's no fear. And Buddha would say, don't be silly, you don't need fear, you need intelligence to know how to get out of the water. So we are very nihilistic. We think Lama Zopa, if he didn't have fear, meaning he didn't have instinct for survival, then he would have sunk to the bottom of the river and gone, oh well, I'm drowning, what the hell? That's nihilism. He knew he was drowning, but there wasn't any fear. He simply adjusted his behavior in order to get the hell out of the water. Nothing wrong with that. That's intention, recognition, all the different parts of the mind there. But we assume that that's instinct for survival. We give it that name. It's an over-exaggeration, the Buddha would say. I mean, Buddha's analysis is really quite subtle. There was no fear, he said. So when you realize emptiness, there is no fear. There is only joy. There is only happiness. There is only compassion. There is only wisdom. There is only love. There can't be anything else. They're gone. This is Buddha's entire point. That's what he means by nirvana, not some place like heaven. It's the cessation of suffering and its causes. He's meaning it literally. But because of such a different analysis, we can't hear it. We just hear it as a bunch of religious ideas, It's very interesting. But I think we can prove this. That woman, Sunny, you can deduce from her behavior that this is my analysis based on using Buddha's view of the mind, observing her behavior and observing how she talked about it. She didn't have very strong attachment. She couldn't have. She couldn't have had very strong anger. Literally, we don't think. This seems silly to us. We don't think this is sensible psychology. We give all these fancy names to our psychological states, but Buddha keeps it very simple. You've got virtuous states of mind. You have intelligence and clarity and kindness and compassion. You have attachment and anger and jealousy, etc. So if the delusions are extra strong, then your suffering is unbearable. It's sort of obvious. Look at a person who gets a lot of attachment to get their own way and then really strong anger when they don't. Have a look at them shouting. You say, oh, look at him, he's angry, but he's having a complete panic attack. Oh my God, how dare you do that to me? You are wrong. We scream and shout and yell. It is clear that all the delusions are rooted in fear. It is so clear. When a person's got less anger, less attachment, they're more reasonable, they're less fearful, they're more flexible, they suffer less. That's how come she could change her mind in this insane environment with these outrageous things happening. She said, I decided. They couldn't take my mind from me. I decided. I'm not in a cell. I'm not in a cave. I'm not in a cell. I'm in a cave. I'm not in a prison. I'm a monk. I'm not a prisoner. I'm a monk. She was able to have the intelligence and the space in her mind because of not much anger, which is very concrete, not much attachment, which is very concrete, not much ego grasping, which is very concrete and solid, which sees things in an absolute self-existent way. She had more flexibility. Her mind was more spacious. Therefore, less fear. Therefore, less suffering. This is logical. I mean, in my own experience, I often tell this experience. I'm not some kind of special person, but it's my experience. And when I got held up in New York City when I was there a long time ago, before I was a nun. It was 1974, and apparently I was living in New York, but I love New York. I didn't think about it. I'm not worried about people. I don't care about rapists. I don't care about violent people. They don't worry me. I don't know why. It's just my mind. I don't care. I didn't get scared going out at night. So I remember one night, it was hilarious, really. Janet and I, my sister, I'll give the background. We were both, when we lived in London, I might have told the story here before. Some of you might have heard it. But we'd lived in London with these radical, political activists. And my sister was into shoplifting. It sounds so silly, and it sounds awful. But she was, and we thought it was very grand, stealing from the rich for the poor. We'd steal from go down Oxford Street at Christmas time and steal our Christmas presents and send them to our family. I mean, it sounds ridiculous. Anyway, we got to New York. I gave it up. I thought it was dumb, I didn't want to get caught. So Janet was still stealing a bit when she came to New York. And when we'd been to this Irish bar down on the Lower East Side in New York, we had no idea how much fear there was in New York. When I got to New York, I could not believe there's 5 locks on doors. Everybody who's come from New York, people have police locks. I'd never seen anything like it in my world, except in war zones. I mean, New York just was clearly living in fear. I couldn't believe these New Yorkers, So, I mean, then ladies would have whistles and it was insane. Anyway, all I know is we were walking back home at 2 a.m. on the Lower East Side, and Janet still had her glass of wine. She took from the Irish bar. We'd been to the bar, This is the background to the story. And this dude comes out of nowhere with a gun, and it's in between my breasts, right? So all I remember is this gun. I'd never seen a gun before. I remember these words like you read in novels, cold, hard metal. It was, I tell you. And I remember, and he has to be pretty close to me, right? There's a gun in my breasts. And the memory I have of it, because this is what happens to me. I'm a very feisty person, get very angry easily, and I'm not afraid of these things. I don't know why, it's just my nature. I remember being outraged. In a second, I thought, who does this? And I started giving him a lecture, because he kept saying, give me your money. He swore. And all I remember is saying to him, and I remember thinking so clearly, how dare this guy ask me for my money? I said, excuse me, mate, and I swore at him, used rough words, and I'm looking at him in the face. It was this close. And I remember my fear quickly turned into sort of logic, like I was his mum, I said, who do you think you are? How dare you? And I used logic. I said, we are just as poor as you. You give me your money. It was kind of ridiculous when I tell the story, So I wasn't scared. I wasn't afraid. Well, my fear turned into this logic and being like his mum. This poor guy, I could tell he was much more afraid than me. I could tell. There was no fear there. My fear channeled and became logic and analysis and demanding. I said, we're just as poor as you. And then every now and again, I heard Janet say, hey, brother, have some wine. And he said, I don't want your fucking wine. I want your money. And she kept saying to me, Robina, give him some money. And I said, no, you give me your money. This was like a comedy, Not to mention the fact that we had English-sounding accents. And for this American guy, any Americans, when they see English-sounding accents, get completely carried away. So he could not get over this weird scenario of these 2 crazy white girls, shouting at him and saying, give him his money. He gave up. He could not. He just gave up and walked away. It was too much for his poor mind. But my point is this. I didn't plan to be this way. There was no fear. So listen to this, people. When there's no fear, there's no suffering. Because basically, I made a fool of him. He's probably the one who felt most miserable. Because his ego was really upset, When there's no fear, there's no suffering. I didn't have any PTSD and have to go and have therapy. I'm not being rude. I just didn't. This is my nature. So that I learned that. When there's no fear, there's no suffering. The ego grasping in me turned into sort of like an active tool I used, you know. I mean, you hear stories about this, how women hit guys with an umbrella, and we just joke, oh, that's little old ladies, you know. But no, maybe it's just different in some people's minds. Luckily, I mean, fortunately, I'm not dead, you know. And just example, it's simple. I learned that then. That was before I was a Buddhist. I learned that. When there's no fear, there's no suffering. When there's no fear, there's clarity. It's a very interesting experience. I mean, it's a bit shocking for people, I suppose, but this guy won't probably hold up a person in second time, I don't think. He got such a shock, couldn't believe it. Anyway, that's my example of fear. Fear is the nature of attachment, anger, jealousy, pride, or the suffering, or the nightmare of the world. We don't call it fear, but it's all fear. We're driven by constant anxiety, worries, fears. What about this? What about that? That's attachment. Anger, all the stories, all the stuff in our head, you know. There's no peace in our mind because of these delusions. So you can see, my point is this, as you even begin to lessen the delusions slightly, you become less fearful and more content. That's the point. You don't wait till you realize emptiness to feel happiness. It's a gradual process. I mean, I can say that much with certainty. I'm not saying I've got any realizations, but I can say with certainty over these hard years, working hard on my mind over these years, learning Buddha's view, trying to put it into practice, definitely I'm more content, definitely less angry, definitely less fearful, definitely more optimistic, more happy. No question. I can argue, I can say that. So it's a gradual process. This is Buddha's method for lessening pain and suffering and delusions and nonsense. That's all. It's Buddha's method, that's all. What else, people? Any questions? No questions.
Gosh, I have one from actually, I think
Good,
it was last week or the week before. This is Ralph again, if that's okay.
Yeah, good.
And I'm going back to some notes here, and I remember it just stuck in my mind. I was thinking about it this morning, and that is the question of why. You think you had stated why self-loathing makes sense.
Okay, I understand. That's a very interesting question. I understand.
I'm sorry?
It's a good one. Shall I answer it?
Okay.
Give you the Buddhist view, shall I?
Please.
Okay.
Thank you.
My feeling is this. Listen to this, okay. Okay. The deepest, kind of most energetic level of the suffering of attachment from having practiced attachment before, which means we come into this life programmed with this, it is called dissatisfaction. So it's a very polite word. Oh, I'm dissatisfied. But think of it, Ralph. When that dissatisfaction is very deep, it's not just dissatisfied with the handbag I get. It's not just satisfied with the weather, with the food, but it's a dissatisfaction with myself. I am not enough. I am not good enough. That is self-loathing. So what we got to analyze is why this feeling of dissatisfaction comes from practicing attachment. Well, it's fairly logical. What attachment is, so just think of an ordinary example day to day. Attachment is this emotional hunger. Now, first of all, attachment is the deepest level from past attachment that you're born with this dissatisfaction, which means I haven't got enough. Then you think, well, what am I going to find? So attachment looks out there and discovers a chocolate cake. Then attachment now increases its job, and it makes the cake look more delicious than it is. And the attachment makes me believe that when I get the cake, it will fill up the gaping hole and I'll get satisfied. So we believe the cake is the cause of happiness. So then all of this is a working of attachment, unspoken, instinctive. And then I get the cake, and then I'm expecting what? All that build-up, I'm expecting satisfaction to come from the cake. That's what I've got the cake for. So we know the first mouthful is pretty nice, but we're not satisfied yet, Ralph. Why are we not satisfied? Because cake cannot give us satisfaction. So we think another mouthful might do it, and then we think the next mouthful might do it. But suddenly we realize the pleasure that did come, some satisfaction did come, some pleasure did come. But as you have the next piece, because you're not satisfied with the previous piece, because the nature of attachment by default is to never be satisfied. So that's why you keep eating more. And the hope is always that when I get the next piece, somehow happiness will come. And we all know what will come is a full stomach, and you'll vomit if you have another piece. So that's the consequence. That's what you get from getting the cake. Attachment thinks happiness and satisfaction will come from getting the cake. But as my mother would say, the more you get, the more you want. So all you're left with is more dissatisfaction and hunger for even more cake. So it's downhill. It's a complete nightmare. And Buddha says we've been practicing this for eons. So of course, the consequence of more attachment is less satisfaction, more dissatisfaction, and it even gets to the point where I am not enough. I am no good. I am fat. I am ugly. I am horrible. I want to kill myself. It's the result of practicing intense, never-ending attachment. Can you hear that?
Yes.
Okay.
Direct spiral downward.
That's right, darling. That's
Thank
the
you.
one. That's the one, you know. So we keep hoping the next one will do it, the next cake, the next boyfriend, the next job. It's automatic and it's frantic. It's driven by this frantic yearning for satisfaction. Now, the frantic yearning for satisfaction is good. Buddha says we all want happiness. We all don't want suffering. He just says, sweetie pies, you're using the wrong method. So right now we think happiness, satisfaction comes when we get what attachment wants. He says, no. Happiness, satisfaction comes when you give up attachment.
So this also then would go to when I've had this feeling that when I'm going through a depression, that it feels very selfish, you know?
That's right. It is. It's part of the function of I, which is not to beat ourselves up. This is why we suffer, Ralph. And, you know, you said depression. This is what's interesting. One of the responses when this attachment keeps not getting what it wants, the main response is aversion. Aversion is, oh no, go away. And aversion, when it's volatile, is anger. But in your case, you experience it internally, which is depression. It's the build-up of aversion, which is thwarted attachment. Again and again, you try to get happy. Again and again, you get disappointed. That disappointment for you, for me, it turns into anger and beats someone up. For you, it goes in and becomes inert and depressed. Depression and anger are different expressions of the same problem, which is thwarted attachment, which is aversion.
One last, and I'll stop speaking.
Go on.
You had mentioned it a moment ago, the hole, the big hole, the dark hole pointing to your chest.
That's right.
And I used to hear that mostly in recovery community, you
That's
know?
interesting.
But now I hear it.
Well, this is what Buddha's based. This is
know?
a way of, I mean, Buddha mightn't have said there's a hole there, but that's why you're dissatisfied. If you're always dissatisfied, there's a hole there. There's something missing. So we crave to fill it up, don't we? That's what attachment is. That's Buddha's analysis of attachment. That's why you'd hear that in recovery. I mean, you see, being an alcoholic or being a junkie or jumping on 10 boys every day, that's just extreme examples of attachment. We're all junkies, Ralph. It's just a question of degree and a question of the object. Do you understand?
I heard one of my favorite Trappist monks said in a book, we're all addicted to something, even if it's simply the human, actually, more accurately, he said, we're all recovering from something, even if it's just the human condition. Which
There you
I thought
go.
was
That's a
brilliant.
good point. There you go. That's exactly right. That's right, Ralph. So it's just that I think the Buddha's analysis it just goes into much more depth than we would do in our culture, you know, because we give other names to all these things and other reasons and other causes, you know. It's very fascinating. What else, people? Any other questions?
Venerable, I have a question.
Good, sweetheart.
Thank you for your teachings.
Good, darling.
This goes back to the story of Lama Zopa falling into the river.
Mm-hmm.
So when he's in the river and his head is bobbing up and down, who cognized the thought, the Laudo Lama?
I understand that exactly. It's a good question, Kathleen. Let's analyze it carefully. Let's just forget that. That's not the question. The better part of putting this is exactly the same thing. We'll make a statement. He made a statement, the Laudo Lama is about to die. I'll make a statement, I'm holding a cup in my right hand. So in each case, This case is quite straightforward, and you can look over here where the sound is coming from, and you recognize a thermos, you recognize a right hand, and you know the sound is coming out of me, so I say I, and you tick the boxes and you go, that's a valid statement. Robina is holding a thermos with her right hand, isn't it? Would you agree? Now let's analyze it. This is the question, the same with Lama Zopa, which part of Robina is doing which job? Well, we would say the right hand of Robina is holding the cup the right hand is holding the cup. So which part of the right hand? Well, it's the little finger's doing that, and the index finger's doing this, and the thumb is doing that. And then we realize we've got to have the mind involved. So which part of the mind? Because Robina is made up of body and mind. So which part of the mind is doing which job in this particular action? Well, the intention is the mind, and that's the thought, I will hold the cup. Attention is the mind that makes sure everything is working well. Concentration is another part of my mind. Mindfulness, not forgetting what I'm doing, otherwise I drop the cup. They're all working all over time and all instinctively. So there are probably hundreds of parts of Robina working together, all hand in hand, to have the experience of Robina holding a cup in her right hand. It's dependent arising. And if we keep doing that analysis, you're not going to find a piece called I that has any role to play. Just like in the IKEA box, you won't find a piece called I. So conventionally you can say I, but there's no piece called I. The hand is holding the cup. So Lama Zopa's mind was cognizing that Lama Zopa was drowning. And which part of Lama Zopa's mind? His intention, attention, discrimination, concentration, mindfulness, all these parts of the mind are all working together for Lama Zopa to have a cognition called the person known as Lao Lama is about to drown. Do you understand me?
I do. Thank you.
Good. Dependent arising. But it's like shorthand. I am drowning. I'm holding a cup. That's sort of shorthand. But then you analyze those experiences. This is looking for the I in the IKEA box. You won't find a piece called I that does any job holding the cup. You won't find a piece called I. And this is the interesting point, Kathleen. This is when you study all this stuff. You know, and this is very helpful in the way the Tibetans teach it. It's really excellent. We say, I am angry. I am depressed. Every time we say that, we are reinforcing the fantasy I. We're reinforcing this belief in the I that is depressed, the I that is angry, the I that is fat. But what they say is anger does that. Jealousy thinks this. Love thinks that. Attachment thinks this. They're more precise, and it's a really brilliant view. You see the parts of your mind. Anger thinks this. Not I am angry. Anger does this. Love does that. And so also the other crucial piece, when we really start, we looked at this last week, I think, when we really start to look at the particular analysis that argues with the belief that the whole of this aggregates is me. One way to, as Lama Zopa says, the basis for the label I, the body and mind, can't be the label. So I is not the body and mind are not the label. So this idea that the label is not the base, then we get into the habit of saying, I am the person called Kathleen. We say, I am Kathleen. No. This is accurate language. But as Geshe Tekchok laughed and said, well, when someone says, who are you? You don't say, oh, I'm the person called Robina. He says, just shut up and be normal and say, I'm Robina. But I am not Robina. I is the label for the basis of, and that's the parts. So he able to say the person known as the Lao Lama. It means he didn't have any clinging. When he saw the person is about to drown, the head, he was being very objective. That's the kind of objectivity and analysis and clarity we need to cultivate to get past this constant identity as this concrete me all the time. Do you understand?
Yes, thank you.
Good, darling. What else, people? What else is there to talk about then? With so much, I'm sure there's so much I haven't talked about properly. I'm sorry. So, okay, how to put this into daily life? This is the point. I remember the Dalai Lama was so marvelous as usual. Someone said, how do you put emptiness into practice in daily life, Your Holiness? And he said, it's so simple. You just see something from another point of view. Now listen to me, folks. That's what Sunny did. This is emptiness. Always use the other example. At the same time as I read about Sunny, I know Sunny now. In fact, my Body Teacher Trust is supporting her. We give her some money every month. She's amazing. She lives in Ireland now. She's old. And her old husband, who's Irish, he was also accused of murder. They both got off death row, and they're now helping other people who've been exonerated from being falsely accused. So they're such the dearest people in the whole world, They live in Southern Ireland. Anyway, when I first read about Sunny, I also read about, at the same time, another guy who was also on death row, who was also innocent, okay? So he was what we'd call normal. Listen to this now, this is the point. He went completely out of his brain. He was just found raging daily as long as he had a voice. I did not rape and kill that woman. I did not rape and kill that woman. He was out of his brain with despair and insanity. Now we say that's normal, and it would be in normal terms because you're so outraged, you're innocent, your attachment is offended, you go crazy, you're angry, you can't believe no one believes you. It's the nightmare, and every one of those delusions is all there. But this is the point, people. This is emptiness. If you'd gone to him and said, well, I've met this woman called Sunny, and she's in the same situation, and her husband was executed, and she lost her children, and her mother was killed. She decided she'd change her mind. She decided she'd see it from another point of view. So she's become quite content with it. She's still working on her freedom, but her mind is more clear. He would think you're insane. Think about this. He wouldn't even be able to hear you. Look at us when we have our small problems, when your daughter offends you, when the husband is mean to you, when the person, look at our ordinary life and how hard it is to even begin to consider the possibility that we can interpret the mean husband, the unkind daughter from another point of view. It's impossibly difficult. This proves ego grasping is running the show. This ignorance, this concrete, solid grasping at things as having an inherent nature. What do you mean, see my daughter from another point of view? She was mean to me. She's rejected me. They are facts. But she could see it, but you can see it from another point of view. That's the miracle. And that's proving that nothing has an intrinsic nature. Of course it's difficult. Oh my God, it's difficult. Look at our small examples. That's putting emptiness into practice. See it from another point of view. That's dependent arising. And that's the brilliance of the intelligence that makes us human. That's what we can use to get enlightened. If we can't see something from another point of view, that's the nature of ego grasping. That's the nature of maripa, the root delusion that sees things as fixed, set in stone, absolute, unchanging. That's it. That's the nightmare. That's the nightmare of suffering. Animals have it 1 billion times more strong than humans. 1 billion times stronger. Their ego grasping is 1 billion times stronger. Their attachment is 1 billion times stronger. Their anger is 1 billion times stronger. And therefore their suffering is 1 billion times more than ours. This does not seem evident to us. This is the suffering of an animal's mind, And they don't have any access to their virtue. They cannot see things from another point of view, in general. That's why we shouldn't waste this precious human life. Use our ability to be spacious, to see things from another point of view. Of course it's difficult. Oh my goodness. And why should we? Because sanity comes from it. That's why. That's why the woman, my friend, stayed sane. I decided. She said, I couldn't change anything. But they couldn't take my mind from me. So I decided, I'm not in a cell. I'm in a cave. I'm not a prisoner. I'm a monk. So perhaps you can think, oh, well, she's just making up a story. She's being ridiculous. No, this is the point. Listen to this. This is the point. Listen to this. Listen to this. If something can function as that, then it's valid. So a cell can function as a cave. You can decide I'm not a prisoner, which is a whole conceptual story of how I'm horrible and ugly and people have accused me. But I'm a prisoner. I'm a monk, and I'm deciding to live in a cave and meditate. You can do that, and the self functions as that, and you can function as that. So it's valid cognition. It's not set in stone. I mean, the interesting point was she never stopped trying to get her freedom, but she kept her sanity, and she finally got out of prison. I wonder if that other guy did, because when you're completely out of your brain, you can't think of anything. You just rant and rave and go mad. She kept her sanity. It's incredible. For me, she's the most amazing example. You know, it's very fascinating. This is all about emptiness, you know. Nothing has an intrinsic nature. It's so hard. Look at us. When the smallest wrong thing happens, the hurt, the offense, the upset, the grasping at the me, not criticizing. This is why we suffer, people. It's unbelievable.
Could you share with us some of the benefits of possibly or potentially reciting the Heart Sutra daily?
No, it's a good point. You know, I mean, yeah, I mean, if it is the Buddha's word, which is said to be coming out of the mouths of Shariputra and Avalokitesvara, passed down for these 2,500 years, if it is the words of the Buddha, if it is the actual thoughts of the Buddha, and that, you know, that seems quite powerful to me. You know, anybody could say the words, but if those words have emanated from the mind of the Buddha, who is a person who's realized this, those words have kind of a taste, I think. So I think it's very powerful just to recite. It's one of the things I recite. First thing in my prayers in the morning, just incidentally telling you, it's my very first one I do is the Heart Sutra. That's my own choice. I just decide, you know, do the Heart Sutra. So I think it has to build up, you know, because you're saying those words every time, and words leave a seed in the mind. They leave an impression, and then every time you hear about emptiness, it kind of keeps triggering. You're programming your mind with it. You know, it might be not explicit in the beginning, but I think it's a really excellent practice, and it's such a sweet sutra. Everybody loves it, you know. And of course, it's short, not like one of those 400-page sutras that blow your mind reading, isn't it? So I think it's very delicious to do it every day. And to memorize it, of course. It's helpful to memorize it. What else, people? Nothing? I've run out of words, I'm sorry. Nobody else has any questions? Anything for me? No questions, Wolfgang? You usually have a question. No questions? What do you think?
Yes, if nobody else has a question,
Good, come on.
I'm analyzing this woman in the cell.
Yes.
And why is it necessary to paint it pink? Isn't it clever to say, okay, I'm in the prison, it's completely miserable, it's completely horrible, but nevertheless, it's not mandatory that I feel bad about it. I don't have to paint it pink.
No, but that is how but that is exactly what she's not stupid. In other words, I hear your point. It's a very good point. But you're saying paint it pink. That would be I think if you're hallucinating and you're insane and you actually think you're in a pink room, that's mental illness. But she was effectively saying that. She never forgot for one damn second, Wolfgang, that she was in a disgusting environment around people who didn't believe her, who believed she killed 2 policemen, her husband dead. None of that. She never forgot that for 1 millisecond. I hear your point. It's just the way she said it to herself to give herself courage. She lived in that nightmare every day. She talked a little bit about it to me privately. It was like day after day after day, 24 hours a day in this single cell with a Bible and herself and nothing else, going mad. So she did not paint it pink. Actually, she wasn't living in La La Land. She said those words, but she lived daily with the nightmare, but she was able to see it differently. So she wasn't living in a fantasy. That's the point you're making.
And that's a tricky part. How can you do this? As a small other example, you have a child, and you know the child is completely horrible. It's a complete difficult child, and you don't paint him pink. You know, he has a lot of trouble. How can you nevertheless?
I'll tell you. This is this is the same point, Wolfgang.
Yeah.
First of all, what is the conventional reality? A child who is out of control, a child
Yeah,
who's
it's
got
there.
anger, a
It's a
child
fact.
who's making crazy. That's a fact,
Yeah.
and that never
That's a
changes.
fact.
So the difference is this. If you see him through the lenses of your anger, which are saying, how dare this child do this, he is wrong, beat, kill, scream, or you see him through the lenses of kindness and compassion, that's the difference. You see him through the lenses of kindness and compassion, then you stay sane and you have empathy with the human boy and you have more wisdom to know how to help him. You see him through anger and rage, you just want to kill him. That's the difference.
Yeah. Now I understand.
And
you.
when
So
your
the
mind
trick
is kind and loving and compassionate, you are more in touch with dependent arising. When your mind is full of anger and rage, you're single-pointed, raging, concrete, solid, immovable, going nuts. That's the point.
Yeah, now I understand you.
Good.
Nevertheless, you see the child is horrible.
Yes.
And you say, yeah, the child is horrible.
That's
But
right.
when you see it with kindness,
That's right.
then you can think, when you see it with kindness,
Yep.
then you can think,
That's
what
right.
can I do?
Precisely. That's the
Yeah.
whole point. That's exactly what Sunny did. She never forgot
Yeah.
that there was in this disgusting prison. She never
Yeah.
forgot it was a nightmare, but she was able to interpret it differently. But it didn't mean she lived in a fantasy land going mad. That's insanity.
That's insanity.
Yeah.
But now I understand you. With
Good.
the example, change
Yeah.
the lenses
Yes.
from anger to
Yes.
kindness.
That's
Yeah.
that's the point in all the Buddhist psychology, Wolfgang, that the delusions are rigid, concrete, blocked, eye-based. They're the neurotic ones, and they just see only the ugliness and they exaggerate it. But the virtues are spacious and they're rooted in dependent arising, which is more interdependent, more spacious. It's a miracle
Thank
of
you.
difference. It does, in other words, it's not chucking the baby out with the bathwater. It's not painting it pink.
Yeah.
It's a really good point, Wolfgang. Thank
Yeah.
you very much. I'm glad you asked.
Venerable Robina, what came up for me just now when Wolfgang was speaking about the child was that the child suffers. The child is suffering. That
That's
a child,
right. Yeah.
controlled child must be suffering.
That's right.
Same thing, I
That's
suppose,
also the
right?
point.
And
That's right. So
compassion.
Wolfgang, when you, and this is the point, Wolfgang, in the junior school and high school part of the work, when we start to look at our own anger and our own annoyance and our own jealousy and our own misery and our own depression, and we see how that's hell for our mother, then we see that that's what's causing me suffering. When you can see that for you, you can see it in the child and you have compassion, but you're very firm and clear and you're not seeing pink. You're being you might even be tough because it's coming from the right place. You know they're suffering, but they're making everybody else crazy as well. But when you see it through anger, all you're doing is seeing it through self-centered lenses, and there's no compassion, there's no empathy, and you don't see any suffering whatsoever. That's a really good point, yes. Thank you, Ralph. This is the whole point that's underpinning all of the Buddhist psychological model, Wolfgang, about the difference between the deluded states of mind and the virtues. They're not just kind of nice, wishy-washy words. They're very profound, Because the delusions are not rooted in dependent arising. They're rooted in the opposite, concreteness. But the virtues are rooted in dependent arising, seeing it from a different point of view, more spacious, and therefore more kind and more empathetic. Necessarily. Yeah. I think it's enough.
I have a question, Venerable Robina.
Yes, sweetheart. Yes, Sarah.
Hi. Going along what we were just talking about with Wolfgang and Ralph, I can understand the dichotomy between looking at something with anger or compassion. How would sadness towards something play into that?
Well, it's an interesting state of mind. Why don't you unpack it and unpack the sadness and give me an example?
So my father was diagnosed with dementia, so I'm trying to navigate those changes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, then I would say that sadness seems mostly related to compassion. Isn't
Definitely.
it? It's sad to see this man you loved who had intelligence and was a good person suddenly losing the plot, losing all awareness. It must be very painful. I'd say that's mostly compassion, but it can easily get into self-centeredness if it becomes too much attachment and you get depressed and become hopeless. That's when it goes into the ego part. So you keep it Keep it at the level of empathy, and then learn from it. Learn about impermanence, learn about death. This is going to happen to you, Sarah. This is the nature of reality. So part of the sadness also would be attachment, because attachment doesn't like to see things change. You see your father there, you've seen your father all your life. He's been this self-existent daddy, and suddenly daddy's changing in front of you. So your attachment also is there, and that's disappointed. That suddenly this daddy who you thought was real and existent is not anymore. So learn about grasping at things as impermanent, learn as permanent, and he's not permanent, he's impermanent. So learn about that, and then you'll keep moving and you'll keep practicing and learn from it, and get empathy. And then don't waste your own life as well, because it'll be one day, baby, it'll be you. Do you understand my point? That's the learning. That'll keep you on top of it.
Thank
Do you understand, darling? Meanwhile, yes, compassion, absolutely. Your darling father, and be as kind as you can to him and love him for who he is and tell him what a wonderful man he is, etc., 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 isn't it?
Thank you.
Good, darling. Thank you so much, everybody. Well, it's time to go, I think. All right, you people? Enough? Finished? Until next time?
Just a real quick one.
Yes.
Is conditioned existence synonymous with dependent arising?
That's an interesting point. Okay. No. Conditioned existence is the third kind of, the way they describe, Jack, the subtlest level of suffering. So the first kind of suffering that Buddha talks about in the First Noble Truth is the suffering of suffering, which is the bad stuff happening, the gross stuff, the lower realms or bad things happening in our life. The next level of suffering is the suffering of change, which is the suffering that comes as a result of attachment. The happiness we get doesn't last. It turns into more suffering. That's the suffering of change. But the subtlest level of suffering is called conditioned existence or all-pervasive suffering. And that's the fact that we're born as this human body, with a body of 5 senses, with a mind of attachment, in a world that's made of the 5 sense objects. And so to exist, we are compelled to keep ingesting the 5 sense objects. In other words, we're compelled to perpetuate samsara. So the first kind of suffering is eliminated by stopping harming others. The second kind of suffering is eliminated by giving up attachment. And the third kind of suffering is eliminated by realizing emptiness and stop rebirth altogether in samsara. Okay? Thank you. All right, I think we should finish. Should we do our little dedication? We'll do it. I think I'd rather do the dedication with words, make it sincere between us, okay? So we did the first dedication prayer, which is thinking all these seeds we've planted. Never forget this. This is really encouraging. There's not a millisecond of anything we hear that doesn't stay in the mind. We store it in the mind like a memory. This is very encouraging, you know. Doesn't get lost. We might remember it now, but it's there. One Lama said it's like we're shooting movies all day. Everything gets stored in the mind. It's pretty tasty. So all these seeds we've planted just from listening, we think may we nourish them with our effort from today, from this moment forward. Our effort at practice, thinking about emptiness, thinking about all these things, so we can become better people, so we can become a Buddha eventually, so we can benefit others. This is the long-term goal, okay? So it's a confident kind of thing. Be happy with it. And the other little prayer is, may bodhicitta, this amazing aspiration to only benefit others, which is so high and so marvelous. May that never cease. May it grow and grow in the hearts of all. And may all our lamas, all our holy lamas, His Holiness Dalai Lama, Lamas of Rinpoche, all our holy lamas, all the holy beings on this planet who are keeping these teachings and helping sentient beings, we need them badly. May they continue to live a long life. And may we continue to live a long life. The world needs us badly too. Anybody trying to be virtuous is a pretty good addition to the planet. So be happy with all this. I'll just sing a couple in Tibetan, and you can sing if you like, but just think those thoughts. Jang chob sem chog rinpoche, ma kie panam ke gyu chig, ke pa nyam pa, me pa yang gong ne gong du pel ba shog. Ge wa di nyu du dag, lama sangye drup gyo ne, dro wa chig kyang malu pa, de salaga pa shog. Thank you, sweethearts. Thank you, Rebecca. Thank you, Nicole. Thank you, all of you darling people. So kind. See you somewhere, huh? Yes?
Thank you, Venerable.
You're going to finish by saying something?
Thank you so
you.
much. Yes.
We'll see you Sunday, Venerable
We
Robina.
will. Yeah, good. I'll see you Sunday.
Thank you, Venerable
Fantastic.
Robina.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you so much. Thank
Much
you.
love. Thank you, darling.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.